She was just a translator, until her words turned the ambush around. It was the sound of 3 languages in her head that kept Elara alive, not the quiet click of the machine guns outside the door. She sat there, the air conditioning failing to cool her wet hands, translating the words of a man whose eyes carried the fatigue of entire wars. His voice was deep, rough, a monotone flow of instructions she transferred into a foreign tongue she wore like a second skin. Arabic to English, English to Arabic. An endless current of life-or-death decisions dissected within the abstraction of a conference room. Elara was no soldier, no strategist. She was just a human transmission cable, but she knew her words were the only bullets being fired in that room. Major Thorne, the man at the table, was an icon of respect, a rock who had once saved an entire village from a landmine. Now he was wounded, not visibly, but deep inside. The scars of his last mission traced fine lines around his eyes. He spoke of a convoy mobilizing, of coordinates that required absolute precision. Elara translated the warning, the implied danger, the cold, technical description of the impending operation. She did it mechanically, without emotion, but a storm raged deep within her. Her stomach clenched. It was a feeling she knew, a premonition that was never wrong. It was the knowledge that this wasn't a routine deployment, but a walk into a trap. Her mind screamed. Her lips shaped the foreign language. This is the moment when the routine breaks, she thought, when the curtains fall and the true darkness shows itself. She saw the major, who nodded his thanks. He had accepted her translation. The words were flawless, but incomplete. They lacked the unsaid truth, the cold, hard panic she felt. Then a sound. It wasn't the click of a weapon, but the crunching sound of gravel beneath a heavy vehicle that shouldn't have been there. It was too early, far too early. Heads spun around the room. The monotony was broken. Seconds later, screams followed from outside, screams that abruptly cut off, followed by the unmistakable, metallic sound as a heavy door was violently blown open. They dropped to the floor. The tabletop offered no protection, only a brief psychological barrier. The men drew their weapons, trained movements that executed in fractions of a second. Elara trembled. She wasn't trained. She was just the human intermediary. The feeling of powerlessness threatened to overwhelm her, to paralyze her. She had to break through this moment. She had to do something that wasn't in any manual. The major shouted instructions, but in the foreign language that only she understood, they sounded hollow, dysfunctional, like music without rhythm. She saw the first shadow in the doorway, the weapon raised. He would fire. He would kill them all. She saw his eyes, his pure, undiluted rage. And in that moment of ultimate terror, where her mind froze, she did the only thing she could. She spoke. She didn't speak the major's words. She didn't speak the words of the translation. She spoke a third language, a language she had learned on the fringes of communication, the language of fear, of warning, of total surrender, but she twisted it. She used the specific dialects she had heard in weeks of negotiations, the rhetorical traps they had set for the opponent, and she formed them into a single, clear, overwhelming sentence. Stop. The deal is off. We have an insider. Asterisk, asterisk, she screamed. The words were loud, precise, and they hit the attacker like a physical force. The weapon hesitated. The deal. The attackers knew the term. It was how the local factions referred to their agreements. The deal was off. They had the information they needed, but the sentence, coming from the mouth of the small, civilian woman, shattered his focus. He looked at her, not the armed men behind her, but her, the source of this shocking, unexpected piece of intelligence. His gaze was not one of cold, trained aggression, but confusion, the sudden, paralyzing shock of realizing the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He had anticipated a fight, a desperate defense, not a targeted revelation of internal treachery. That fraction of a second, that sudden stutter in his assault, was all the major needed. Major Thorne, wounded but swift, fired 3 controlled bursts. The attacker crumpled, a dead weight against the splintered door frame. The silence that followed was not the return of peace, but the deafening anticipation of the next wave. Elara felt the heat of the discharged brass casings near her hand. She was alive. They were alive, for now, because she had spoken the right lie in the right dialect. She didn't have time to process the adrenaline or the reality of the dead man blocking the entrance. The major was already moving, his voice sharp and focused. Elara, get the satellite phone. Now. And keep talking. Use that tone, that language. Keep them guessing. His words cut through the ringing in her ears. He understood. He understood that she wasn't just a translator anymore. She was a new kind of weapon. The others, 2 young soldiers, were securing the perimeter, their faces white with shock, but their movements professional. One of them, a medic named Ruiz, pointed a trembling rifle at the door. "What did you say, ma'am?" he whispered, his eyes wide. "I told them the deal was off. I told them they had an insider," she repeated, her voice surprisingly steady, the adrenaline now a cold, clear stream of focus instead of panic. She scrambled to the heavy desk where the satellite phone sat, a clunky relic of secure communication. The screen was cracked. No signal. The explosion must have severed the line. They were completely cut off. That realization slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. Their only chance was the communication she could create with her voice, with her knowledge of the enemy's internal language. She pressed herself against the wall next to the shredded door frame, the dead man's blood slick and metallic in the air. She could hear them now, dozens of voices outside, angry, confused, shouting in a rapid-fire dialect that she recognized as coming from a specific, highly aggressive faction in the northern sector. This was bad. This wasn't a random ambush. It was professional, coordinated, and specifically targeted. She took a deep breath, focusing on the cadence of their commands. She didn't understand the specifics, only the emotional structure. Confusion, then escalating anger, then the command to breach again. She had maybe 30 seconds before they committed to the charge. Major Thorne signaled the others back, forming a tight defensive arc. He gave her a hard, demanding look. "Give them something big, Elara. Something that makes them stop and question everything. Don't tell them anything about us. Make it about them." His faith was absolute, terrifying. She closed her eyes for a split second, allowing the 3 languages to merge in her mind. The functional English of the major's command, the formal Arabic of the negotiations, and the rough, street-level dialect of the attackers. She found the perfect hook, the idea of a double-cross within their own ranks, a concept they valued above all others. Betrayal was currency. She started screaming, her voice raw, desperate, but perfectly articulated in the rapid-fire dialect. "He took the money. He sold the map. Al-Jaburi has betrayed us all. He is coming for the reserves now, fools. Why are you wasting time here?" She didn't scream it out of fear, but as an act of pure theatrical performance. Her voice was designed to sound like an intercepted broadcast, a desperate message from one of their own men. It worked instantly. The shouting outside stopped. The transition from chaotic rage to absolute, shocked silence was instantaneous and total. The narrative structure had shifted. She had introduced a mystery, a new conflict that superseded the one they were currently engaged in. Major Thorne looked at her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of terror and awe. "Al-Jaburi," he mouthed silently. Elara shook her head quickly. She didn't know who Al-Jaburi was. She had pulled the name from the recesses of an old intelligence brief, a high-level, semi-mythical figure known for greed and betrayal, a perfect phantom to destabilize their assault. It was the highest possible emotional escalation. The silence stretched, tense and brittle. The soldiers held their breath, waiting for the counterattack, but it didn't come. Instead, they heard the sounds of confused, argumentative voices, the immediate splintering of their focus. The attackers were now fighting amongst themselves, their loyalty fractured by a single, well-placed sentence. Elara had just used an old rhetorical device, the scapegoat ***, combined with the open loop, to buy them time. The immediate danger had been diverted, but the threat hadn't vanished. The attackers were distracted, not defeated. "It won't last," she murmured, her voice now hoarse. "They'll figure out it's a diversion. We need to move. Now." The fast-paced action sequence transitioned into a slow-burn escape plan. The immediate, visceral conflict was over, replaced by the tense, ticking clock sequence of evasion. Major Thorne nodded, grabbing his medical kit. "They've bought us maybe 5 minutes of chaos. That's all we get. We're going out the ventilation shaft. Ruiz, you lead. Elara, you're the eyes and ears. Tell us what they're saying before they say it." The air was thick with gunpowder and sweat. The ceiling blurred overhead, the rough metal of the air shaft a stark, cold reality. They climbed, one by one, into the darkness, the scraping sounds of their gear muffled by the ongoing, escalating shouting match below. The narrative shifted to the cramped, dark space, focusing on the sensory experience, the metallic tang of the air, the difficulty of breathing, the slow, agonizing movement. This was the reflective, slow-burn part of the sequence. Major Thorne, despite his hidden wound, was calm. "We're heading for the East Wing. It has an access point to the old water tunnels," he whispered. Elara crawled behind him, her knees scraping on the rough metal. She could still hear the voices below, but they were distant now, dominated by internal conflict. They were splitting up, some running off to find this phantom traitor, Aljaburi, others staying behind, suspicious. The seeds of discord had taken root. She was listening intently now, her ears straining to catch every syllable. She heard a specific command, a search pattern, a sweep of the adjacent buildings. They were looking for the source of the communication. They knew the message had to come from inside. The danger was not over. It had merely been redefined. "They're checking the admin building next," she whispered into the major's ear, translating a high-speed command she'd just heard. "They think the source is in the radio room." The major immediately adjusted their route, a silent hand signal diverting Ruiz. The value of her linguistic prowess was no longer just translation, it was precognition. They moved for what felt like hours, but was likely only 20 minutes, through the suffocating darkness of the ventilation system. The suspense built with every creaking grate and every distant footstep. The story transitioned to a moment of profound internal reflection. Elara, curled up in the tight space, began to think about her father, a simple history teacher who had always told her that the most powerful weapon was not a sword or a gun, but a well-constructed sentence. She had always dismissed it as platitude. Now, she understood it was a literal truth. Her words had just saved 4 lives. The memory of the attacker's confused face, the shattering of his purpose by a mere name, was a powerful analogy for the victory of mind over matter. They finally reached the old water tunnels, a damp, cold expanse of concrete and dripping water. The sensory details were sharp, the smell of mildew and rust, the echo of their footsteps. They were out of immediate sight, but they were still trapped. Major Thorne used the silence to examine his wound, a ragged cut on his side that he'd been ignoring. He had to be strong. He had to be a leader. He wrapped it quickly, his face pale but resolute. "We have to find a way to the main base. It's 4 kilometers from here, through the old city," he muttered. Ruiz and the other soldier, a quiet, effective man named Jackson, were busy checking their limited supplies. The immediate threat had receded, and the emotional tone shifted from tense action to hopeful planning and the slow realization of their desperate situation. The scene became about emotional bonding through shared trauma. Ruiz offered Elara a piece of a protein bar, a small, kind gesture. "You're amazing, ma'am," he said, his voice quiet. "You saved us all." The acknowledgement was a symbolic coin, a mark of respect from a soldier to a civilian who had proved her worth under fire. Elara simply nodded, unable to speak, the weight of the last hours settling on her shoulders. She was still a translator, but she was now something more, a participant in the conflict, not just an observer. This was the slow-burn transition, the understanding of the trauma and the forging of a new, unspoken pact between them. They started moving again, the tunnel dark and long, the only light coming from Major Thorne's small tactical flashlight. The narrative focused on the rhythmic, deliberate pacing of their movement, the quiet desperation of the escape. The open loop of Aljaburi was still active outside, buying them time, but they knew it was temporary. The enemy would eventually track them. They had to be faster, smarter. The story shifted outwards momentarily to the confused, angry scene in the compound they had just left. The attackers were divided, some leaving in a frenzy to hunt the phantom traitor, others convinced it was a ruse. The seeds of internal conflict were blossoming, consuming their focus. This brief, omniscient view served to heighten the suspense. The clock was ticking, and they were racing against the enemy's inevitable realization. The major looked back at Elara, his face grim in the low light. "We need one more distraction, Elara. Something that makes them look in the opposite direction." We need to split their forces completely. He was asking her to perform another miracle, to wield her linguistic weapon one more time. The final transition of this long segment focused on the return to action/planning. Elara nodded, her eyes wide, the adrenaline returning, cold and sharp. She was ready. She started speaking again, not shouting this time, but carefully formulating a message designed not to confuse, but to misdirect, using the specific, formal language of high-level intelligence, the ultimate misdirection device. She needed to create a new, undeniable objective for them, one that was far away from the water tunnels and the old city. She pulled the last rhetorical device from her mental arsenal. Asterisk asterisk the highly valued but unattainable prize asterisk asterisk. She whispered, translating the words into a secure communications channel on a scavenged, low-frequency radio. The words were a complex series of code phrases designed to sound like an urgent message from a high-ranking double agent. Target B5 is active. Repeat, Target B5 is active. Priority shift. The package has moved to the northern gate. The Americans are using the old tunnel system to transport the key witness. Intercept the transport at the gate, not the compound. The message was entirely fabricated, a brilliant piece of disinformation. There was no key witness, no transport, and no Target B5. But the language, the technical jargon, and the emotional urgency was designed to be utterly convincing to their internal command structure. They broadcast it on a weak, local frequency, knowing it would be picked up instantly and interpreted as a critical breach in their security. They listened. The moment of suspense was agonizing. Then, they heard it. The roar of engines, the frantic shouting of commanders redirecting vehicles. The sound wasn't coming from the compound they had left, but from the network of back streets surrounding the old city, the very area they were trying to reach. Elara's words hadn't just bought them time. They had shifted the entire battlefield 4 kilometers away. The major gave a slow, relieved nod. Good. We move now. Fast and quiet. The narrative transitioned into the final, desperate rush through the old city's underground network. The emotional tone was now one of tense, purposeful hope. They moved through the darkness, the concrete cold against their skin, the silence broken only by the drip of water. The tension now came not from external assault, but from the constant, internal fear of discovery. Ruiz and Jackson, guided by Major Thorne, navigated the labyrinthine tunnels. Elara, however, was the one truly leading, her mind still focused on the acoustic landscape above them. She was listening for the moment the roaring engines stopped, the moment the enemy realized they had been played for fools. They reached a grate leading to the surface, obscured by decades of trash and dust. It was the point of no return. The major looked at Elara, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. You have to go first. You're the least conspicuous. Find a way to the main perimeter fence. We'll follow as backup. She climbed, the metal cold and rough beneath her hands. The transition to the outside was a shock of sensory overload. The smell of fresh air, the blinding light of the midday sun, the distant, frantic sounds of the chase she had engineered. She was back in the world of the living, but it was a world she had irrevocably altered. She moved through the dusty streets, a civilian out of place, her clothes torn, her face smudged with grease and blood. The narrative focused on the symbolism of her movement, a figure of peace walking through a landscape of conflict, saved only by her ability to manipulate the very language of war. The emotional climax of her journey was nearing. She reached the perimeter fence, the barbed wire glinting menacingly in the sun. She had made it. But behind her, the noise of the chase was dying down. The enemy was returning. They had found the source of the radio transmission, an old, abandoned relay station, and the realization of the ruse was hitting them hard. The chase was over. The hunt for them was beginning. The major and the soldiers emerged seconds later, covered in dust, their weapons ready. There was no time to wait. They had to cross the final expanse of open, exposed ground. This was the final, fast-paced, visceral segment of the escape. They ran, a desperate dash for the gates, the shouts of the returning attackers ringing in their ears. Bullets began to fly, kicking up dust around their feet. They were exposed, vulnerable, relying solely on speed and the distraction she had previously created. Ruiz was hit, a sharp cry, a sudden fall. The major didn't hesitate. He pulled the medic to cover behind a crumbling stone wall, laying down suppressive fire. Elara was still running. She ran not as a soldier, but as a terrified civilian. Yet her movement was purposeful, directed. She reached the gate, a thick, rusted chain preventing their entry. She looked back at the major, pinned down, wounded, protecting his men. She saw the despair in his eyes, the final, terrifying realization that they were not going to make it. In that moment, the narrative provided the final, uplifting and dramatic twist. She grabbed the microphone from the security booth near the gate, a forgotten piece of civil infrastructure. She didn't shout a lie this time. She screamed the truth, but in a way that was more destructive than any lie. She used the language of international law, the technical, cold language of diplomatic immunity and treaty violations, translated into their local dialect. The attack has been witnessed by international observers. Your leaders are being watched. Retreat now, or face total international sanction. This is not a war. This is a crime against humanity. The words were a final, desperate analogy. She was weaponizing civilization against chaos. The attackers, already fractured, hesitated one final time. The threat of global consequence a heavier weight than any bullet. That moment of hesitation, that final open loop of international consequence, was enough. A rescue vehicle, guided by the major's previously secured communications, appeared on the horizon, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. It wasn't the heroic charge of 1,000 men, but a single, beat-up armored vehicle. It was salvation. They scrambled inside, pulling the wounded Ruiz with them. The doors slammed shut, and they sped away, leaving the confused, defeated attackers behind. Inside the vehicle, the tension finally broke. The emotional tone settled into hopeful relief. Major Thorne looked at Elara, blood staining his shirt, but his eyes were clear. He didn't offer a platitude. He just nodded, his face etched with respect. "You didn't just translate, Elara," he said, his voice rough. "You rewrote the damn script." The narrative then transitioned to the slow-burn recovery phase. Weeks later, in a sterile hospital room, Elara was visited by Thorne and the newly recovered Ruiz. They brought her a simple, unexpected gift, a custom-made metal coin, heavy and cool in her hand. One side depicted a globe, the other a single, perfectly rendered quote in Arabic. Words are the sharpest weapons. It was the symbolic acknowledgement of her act of courage, a physical representation of the bond forged in crisis. The final scene showed Elara, back in her normal life, but fundamentally changed. She was sitting in a park, reading a book, but her eyes scanned the crowd, her ears tuned to the ambient noises, her mind constantly translating, analyzing. She was no longer just a translator. She was a warrior of language, forever marked by the day her words turned an ambush around. Her life was a new kind of heroic narrative, a motivational story about the power of the ordinary person to execute the extraordinary. And somewhere, in the intelligence briefs of the local factions, the open loop of the traitor Al-Jabari was still being discussed, the phantom threat that saved the lives of 4 people, all thanks to a woman who knew which words to use. The ultimate, dramatic conclusion.